Richard Whitmore, the billionaire who bought everything his 17-year-old Evan could ever want, still faced a son who mocked him in public, skipped school, and treated him like a stranger. Specialists failed, gifts collected dust, and whispers followed him everywhere. Can't even control his own kid. It wasn't until the old black maid, Margaret, watched Richard break down after another failed attempt at bonding that she told him the truth. No one else dared to say, and from that moment on, everything began to change. Before we go any further, if this is your first time watching one of our videos, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us till the very end. And if this story moves you, drop your thoughts in the comments and share it with a friend. Now let's begin. The Whitmore estate stretched like a fortress of glass and stone across the hillside. Chandeliers glittered in every room, polished marble floors echoed with silence, and servants moved like shadows present but never noticed. At the head of a long mahogany dining table sat Richard Whitmore, a man whose fortune had been built on ruthless business deals and flawless timing. His cufflinks sparkled with gold, his wristwatch could buy a family a house. But across from him sat a 17-year-old boy who didn't even look up. Evan Whitmore, headphones in, hoodie pulled low, for dragging lazily through a plate of untouched food. Richard cleared his throat a little too loudly. The sound bounced off the crystal glasses. How was school? He muttered, "Nothing, not a word." The silence was heavy, suffocating. Margaret, the new maid, shifted quietly near the doorway, dusting a cabinet, though it was already spotless. Her eyes flicked between father and son, seeing a gap so wide it felt like a canyon. Richard tried again. "I got you that new gaming system. Should be in your room now." Evan's lip curled into something close to a smirk. He pulled out an earbud just long enough to let his words cut like glass. "Don't need it. Won't play it." Then the bud slipped back in, and the wall went up again from the hallway. Two staff whispered to each other as they passed. "Kid's spoiled. Rotten," one muttered. "Or maybe he's just lonely," the other replied. Richard heard the whispers. They stung, but he kept his jaw tight, his eyes locked on his son, who sat there, chewing slowly, as if daring him to try again. For all the money in the world, Richard Whitmore had never felt poorer. Richard Whitmore was a man who never heard the word no. In boardrooms, his presence was law. In courtrooms, his money bent reality, yet under his own roof. His son treated him like a stranger. The solution, Richard thought, had to be the same as always, pay for the best. So he lined up tutors, counselors, even a child psychologist flown in from Switzerland. They studied Evan with clipboards and checklists, asking questions that made the boy roll his eyes. One afternoon, Richard paced outside the study while a specialist worked with Evan inside. He rubbed his temple, adjusting the perfect knot of his tie. Minutes later, the man emerged, lips tight. "Mr. Whitmore, there's nothing clinically wrong with your son. He's angry, yes, rebellious, but not broken. What he needs can't be bought." Richard dismissed him with a wave, though the words rattled in his chest like loose coins. Still, he refused to quit. New sneakers, custom suits, a car that gleamed like a mirror. He dropped them into Evan's life like offerings to a silent god. The boy accepted each gift, barely glancing at his father, then tossed them aside. The car setting used in the driveway, dust gathering on its hood. The disrespect bled into public. At a charity dinner, Richard introduced Evan to a group of high-profile friends. The boy sneered, muttered, all fake smiles and shallow pockets before walking away. Laughter bubbled from one corner of the room, but not the good kind. Two investors whispered, "Can't even control his own kid. Maybe money doesn't buy everything after all." School wasn't better. Teachers called about skip classes, fights in hallways, insults hurled like stones. One report described Evan standing on a cafeteria table, mocking his classmates until someone shoved him off. Richard kept writing checks, hoping dollars would stitch the wool. But at night, alone in his office, he loosened his tie and stared at a framed photo of himself holding Evan as a toddler. Back then, his son's tiny hand had clutched his finger with trust. Now, 17 years later, Richard couldn't even get eye contact, and from the kitchen doorway, Margaret watched these failures unfold. She said nothing yet, only polishing silver, her eyes following the slow collapse of a family that looked rich on paper but hollow in truth. By spring, Richard had run out of tricks. Every morning started the same. Chauffeurs waiting by the polished gates, staff moving like gears in a machine, and Evan drifting through it all like a ghost in a hoodie. So Richard devised one last plan, a father-son retreat. No distractions, no excuses, just the two of them tucked away at the family's mountain estate where the pines swallowed self-service. The place looked like a postcard, log beams, stone fireplace, glass windows opening to endless wilderness. Richard imagined evenings by the fire, long talks that would heal the distance. But Evan lasted less than an hour. He stomped upstairs, muttered about fake bonding, and threw himself across the bed when Richard tried to sit beside him. The boy shoved earbuds in and blasted music loud enough to rattle the floorboards. The next morning, Evan was gone down the trail, hood pulled tight, hands stuffed in his pockets. He didn't even leave a note. Richard found him an hour later at the lake, skipping stones alone. The boy didn't look up. Didn't care. That night, Richard sat in the leather armchair by the fireplace, the fire hissing low, and whispered words no one in the world had ever heard him admit. Maybe he just doesn't love me. The words tasted like ash. Margaret, who had accompanied them quietly to manage meals, paused in the doorway. She held a folded blanket in her hands, her eyes soft but steady. "Sir," she began, her voice carrying the weight of decades, "you keep giving him everything except the one thing he's been needing." Richard blinked at her, frowning. "What's that supposed to mean?" She stepped into the room, set the blanket down gently. "These gifts you buy him, they won't mean a thing if you're not there for him. I mean really there." Richard laughed short, defensive. "I've been there. I took him here, didn't I? I spend money time." "No, sir." She cut in softly but firmly. "You spend money, not time. You've been everywhere but beside him. Meetings, flights, handshakes. Meanwhile, your boy, he's been raising himself." The fire crackled. Richard looked away, throat tight. No one had ever spoken to him like this, especially not an employee. But Margaret didn't flinch. She only adjusted the sleeve of her faded cardigan and let the silence sink in. And for the first time, Richard felt the truth pressed down heavier than any deal he had ever signed. The ride back from the mountains was silent. Richard kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting uselessly on the console while Evan stared. Ed out the window, earbuds in, face set like stone. Back at the estate, Richard paced his office, Margaret's words echoing in his skull. "You've been everywhere but beside him." The phrase clung to him like smoke. That night, he found himself lingering outside Evan's door. For years, he had tapped once, left a gift bag, and walked away. Tonight, he knocked, then stepped in without a bribe in his hands. Evan sat at his desk, sketching something on a pad. He stiffened when his father entered, eyes sharp, ready for another empty offer. But Richard didn't pull out a box. He just lowered himself into the chair opposite, clearing his throat. "Hey," he said, voice awkward, almost boyish. "What are you working on?" Evan narrowed his eyes. "Why?" "No reason. Just wanted to know." Silence. The boy turned back to his sketch, pencil scratching. Richard stayed. He didn't talk, didn't check his phone. He just sat there, the clock ticking slow. For the first time, he noticed small things, the way Evan's foot tapped when he concentrated, the way his hair curled at the back of his neck like it did when he was 5. Hours later, Evan muttered without looking up, "You weren't there. Not when Mom left, not when I needed you." Richard's throat tightened. Normally he'd defend himself, talk about meetings, money, survival, but Margaret's voice guided him. "Listen, not to answer, not to argue, just listen." So he did. He nodded, swallowed the lump in his throat, and said nothing. The boy's hand trembled as he shaded in the sketch. "I hated those gifts. They just reminded me you didn't care enough to sit here." Richard blinked hard, forcing back tears he hadn't shed in years. The next evening he tried again. He asked Evan to play chess. The boy rolled his eyes but sat down anyway. By the third match, he was laughing at his father's clumsy moves. On Saturday morning, Richard burned pancakes in the kitchen. Smoke alarm blared. Both of them doubled over with laughter as Margaret fanned the air with a dish towel, shaking her head. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't instant, but something invisible had shifted. For the first time in years, they weren't living as strangers under the same roof. Margaret watched quietly from the hallway, a faint smile tugging her lips. She had shown him the trick, and Richard finally was using it. Weeks rolled into months, and the Whitmore estate no longer felt like a museum. Laughter drifted down hallways where silence once choked the air. Evan's teachers called with updates, this time not about fights, but improvement. He was showing up to class, handing in assignments, even apologizing to kids he'd once mocked. The boy who once sneered at authority now sat in the front row, asking questions that surprised everyone. At home, dinners were different. Richard no longer filled the space with awkward chatter about business or expensive gifts. Instead, he asked about Evan's day, and more importantly listened. Sometimes Evan talked for 5 minutes, sometimes only 1, but every word was real. One evening, Richard invited a few close friends for a small dinner. The last time Evan had sat with them, he'd thrown insults like knives. This time, he shook hands, spoke with confidence, and even cracked a joke that made the room erupt with laughter. Richard's friends raised eyebrows in quiet surprise from the side. 2 waiters whispered as they cleared plates, "Kid's a different person. Maybe the father changed first." Richard heard it, and for once the sting was gone. They were right. Later that night, his father and son sat on the porch watching the sky fade into stars. Evan leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head. "You know, you're not so bad when you're actually around," he said, smirking. Richard laughed, but his eyes burned. It wasn't a grand declaration, not "I love you" and glittering letters, but it was more precious than any deal he had ever signed. Behind the curtains, Margaret watched with tired but joyful eyes. She didn't need thanks. The proof was right there in front of her. A boy and his father finally seeing each other after years of shadows. In the end, the Whitmore fortune hadn't saved them. Presents had. And for Richard Whitmore, it was the richest gift he'd ever received. And in the end, Richard didn't need another fortune, another car, or another mansion. He just needed to show up. Presents changed his son's heart in a way money never could. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video so more people see it. Subscribe for more powerful stories and share it with someone who might need the reminder. Love can't be bought. It has to be lived.